Micah, welcome back to the Undraped Artist Podcast.
I'm very excited to be here. This is my favorite time of year, and we get to talk about some cool stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm stoked. So I've been playing Christmas music for a week now, and I actually was I was actually gonna like put like mistletoe over our heads and everything else just to celebrate this an awesome episode we're gonna have, but maybe I'll do that in post.
You know what? I've been listening to this fantastic, I can't remember the author off the top of my head. It's on Audible, and it's a 2.5-hour history of the celebration of Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And really about how most of the traditions we have nowadays, at least in the United States and Europe, are only from the mid-19th century. They're only about 150 years old. Some vestiges like trees and other things, but even most of the carols we sing are from non-Christmas traditions that people put Christmas words to in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. And that's going to be true of art we talk about today, because there's a lot
Santa
of
Claus,
art.
even my parents were the first generation to have Santa Claus, even if I'm correct, which is so weird to me.
We'll talk a little bit about that, but you're not wrong. It's really interesting how much Christmas was invented fairly recently. I mean, one of the things that blew me away in this history is, you know, those Advent calendars?
Yeah, we have one.
So Advent calendars, and I love them. I've got like 5 different Advent calendars because I like sweets. Some of them aren't sweet related.
Wait, what?
Right?
Sweets? No, I thought you meant the ones where you take the little, I don't know, what do you call it? Like the little symbol, maybe it's a Christmas tree, and or the ornament, and you take it out of the pocket and you put it on the Christmas tree. And
yeah, I mean, all of them,
until they're
all
all
of those
filled
are Advent
and you get
calendars.
to the Christmas day. Is that an Advent calendar?
The Advent calendar basically refers to Advent, which used to be a religious celebration that was 24 days leading up to Christmas, where you denied yourself food, liquor, sex, dairy, including cheese, sugar. And so it was
that's a sucky
and then you would have the 12 days of Christmas, which were an all-out riotous, raucous, debased party of all the things you wanted to do, right?
Okay.
And so it's interesting how, like, even things like the Advent calendar, as I was listening to this history, I was thinking, man, like the art that we use to celebrate Christmas really was, I think it's going to fit into kind of 2 categories. It's going to fit into the modern era of everything we're familiar with, and then some of it is going to fit into that ultra religious era of denying yourself things and celebrating the heavy side. So I've picked things from both sides of that. And did you bring any art too?
Oh, I forgot I was supposed to bring art.
You don't have to.
Wait a minute.
I've got enough for both of us.
Oh, do you? Okay. I totally spaced it. Part of me wants to stop and grab some art. Should I stop and grab some art, or should we keep going?
No, if you want to, but I've got enough for both of us.
Okay. All right. Let's just go with yours today. Maybe next Christmas, okay. I'm going to bring some.
Okay. So put up my number 1 image.
Okay.
Yeah. You recognize this, buddy?
Oh, great. Well, I recognize the figure, but I don't know who the artist is.
Okay. Do you see what he's holding in his right hand?
Oh yeah, Coca-Cola. So this is the original, not the original, but this is the first time that the red suit was introduced.
Kind of. Okay, so I had to look this up because there are a lot of people who've written about the subject, right? So Hayden Sundblom, who was born in Michigan to Scandinavian parents, he was born in 1899. He goes and studies at the American Art Academy in Chicago, which was essentially a hybrid of the French model and commercial art. It was founded in 1923, and I don't even know if I don't even recognize the names of the artists who helped found it. But I was going to their website. By the way, Kanye West is one of their alumni.
Really?
Yeah, because they're the American Academy of Art. They call it the American Academy of Art College now. Does all kinds of different artistic endeavors. But in the 1920s, it was started by this artist named Frank Young, and I'm looking it up right now. And Frank Young was really the artist, and he had studied in Paris. There isn't a lot of information on him, and he's got artists doing everything from nude drawing classes to clothing design and drapery to lithographic to lino cuts to all kinds of things. Like these students are graduating after 4 years with the expectation that they will be clothing designers, magazine illustrators and cover artists, portrait artists, and that they'll be doing industrial design. Like even if they go to an engineer who says, I've got a design for an engine, a graduate of this school is supposed to be able to do an artistic rendering of the engine, right? I mean, this is a very broad group of skills. Sundblom graduates. He works for a few years, and he does everything from like magazine illustrations for Boys Life to pinup girls. Does a lot of pinup girls. And then in 1931, Coca-Cola commissions him to do Santa Claus. So I don't know what year this Santa is from, but before we talk about who inspired him, I want a portraitist perspective on how good this is.
I'm geeking out over this thing. Don't you like it?
I love it. I went into a
so good.
I tried to go to a high resolution version.
Yeah, this is, you look at the way the beard is both painted positively, meaning he's painting the beard itself and making strokes that represent hair, but then he's cutting into it with the negative space, bringing that red into it. It kind of reminds me of Josh Clare's Clouds, the way he's painting that beard. I wonder if there's some connection there, if there's some influence. Maybe not directly, but yeah, it's gorgeous. The color is beautiful. It's gorgeous.
And he's got this, it's almost got this Dutch Golden Age element of this minimalist background that you could say is like a Frans Hals or a Rembrandt. And then all the warm colors in front of that are not really Dutch. I mean, Dutch colors would be a lot more restrained than this. I'm surprised at how hot it is. And then he's got these cool highlights throughout it.
Yeah.
It's kind of magical, really, isn't it?
Or the rim lighting. Yeah. Yeah. The skin is just orange. It almost looks like he's being lit by a fireplace. And then maybe window light for rim light behind him. It gives it this really warm, festive quality to it. It's really well thought out.
He paints this in 1931, right? But he himself says that his inspiration is another artist who, at the time that Christmas cards were becoming popular in the 19th century, the first Christmas cards didn't really happen until like the 1860s. And the woman who is largely in charge of those Christmas cards is named Jenny Nystrom. She's mostly Christmas cards in Sweden. This is what she's famous for. So go to the next image, because this is a Christmas card by Jenny Nystrom.
Okay.
Here is what is super frustrating about what we're looking at here. I'm just going to read you from her Wikipedia page, Jenny Nystrom. Okay. In 1865, she started at the Gothenburg Art School. In 1873, she was admitted to the Royal Academy of Swedish Arts in Stockholm, where she studied for 8 years. Then she followed that with studies in Paris at the Académie Calarossi and the Académie Julienne. she studied with Bouguereau and with Jules Lefebvre. So she comes back having done almost 12 years of studies at some of the best schools in the world. And the only place she can find a commercial or any monetary real application for her art are in sicky sweet kind of Christmas cards, we would probably call them today, that are cartoonish. But you know, there are a few images. I was only able to find a few images of her paintings. They weren't high resolution enough to share with you. She had some serious chops, but this is what she became famous for. And they were first reproduced in Sweden, and this is a Swedish version of Santa Claus that's in the red cap, long beard, the gloves, and then HEIN Sundblom, whose family is from Sweden and Norway, bring her image into his life, and then he adapts it in the 30s. So
wait, what do you
according
mean?
to most
He
scholars,
adapts this. I'm sorry. He adapts the
there's
Santa
so
Claus?
many versions. This and
Or
she
this
did
actual
several
painting?
different, not this actual one, but her version of Santa Claus. And there are a lot of different versions that she did that are all pretty much this guy who's in a heavy red velvet coat that's trimmed with fur, that has a belt and a hat, and it has a long beard. He's kind of like a large elf in her versions of Christmas, and he takes that. And the crazy thing was, Jeff, I read like 5 or 6 different articles about the origins of Santa Claus and the modern version of Santa Claus. Half of them talk about just Sundblom's version. About half of them talk about Sundblom being influenced by Nystrom. None of them mention the next artist.
Okay, before we move on from Nystrom, though, first of all, I got a question for you. Did you read those articles for the podcast?
Yeah, I did.
Dude, okay. All of you listeners of the podcast need to reach out to Micah and give him some gratitude for Christmas, because for crying out loud, he's getting nothing for this podcast, and he read all those articles. And
well, I am getting Christmas cheer out of this.
He is the busiest guy I know. So thank you, Micah.
So
That's
nice
really generous of you to do that. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, do you have any evidence of her classical training? Have you seen any paintings of what her classical work looks like?
I've seen just like 1 or 2. The problem is that almost everything she does seems to be controlled by the printing companies. And I don't know if they're getting another artist who's putting them into lithographic form, because she seems to paint in oils and then somebody else transfers them into a different medium.
Well, what I want to know,
I get the sense that a lot of her training gets lost in that.
Okay, so what I want to know is if the way she's painting is a stylistic choice, or if it's not. I mean, because I had a student, her name was Brooke Smart. Brooke, you're going to have to forgive me. I don't know your new married name. I forgot. But do you mind if I pull her up real quick, Micah?
Not at all.
Because I just wanted to show you this real quick. So let me pull up Instagram. Oh my gosh, how funny is that? She's the first one to come up. So her name still is Brooke Smart. Oh man, okay. Google's watching me. Okay, so I got it right. She's still going by Brooke Smart. So I guess I don't need forgiveness after all. So Brooke is an amazing artist. She was my assistant and student, like 17 years ago. And she is an incredible classical painter. She could paint anything. But this is what she chooses to do. She does these incredible murals like this. Up the staircase. Isn't that cool? She's got murals all over Salt Lake City, but then she does cards, and she just did these really cool. I should get her on the show.
There is no doubt that Nystrom is doing the same kind of thing. She is the Christmas card craze of the 19th century is a real thing. Like people, and we could go on a tangent that would be so satisfying here. There are Christmas cards with dead bugs on them, Christmas cards with people who are nude making their bodies into the shapes of the alphabet saying Merry Christmas. There are the weirdest and coolest Christmas cards. But Nystrom makes almost all her money doing these really family, small children, elf type things where it doesn't look anything like her classical work, in my opinion. And I'm not an expert on her, but as I was looking it up, I thought, if you were to put her work in a lineup and say, which one of these artists trained with Jules Lefebvre and Bouguereau, she would not end up on the list, right?
Oh, no way. Yeah, and you wouldn't think that of Brooke
No
Smart
way.
either.
No, but she was so influential
Yeah.
that because her cards became the basis for how a lot of those people who moved in, you got to think, like, he's from Sundblom, who painted the Coca-Cola Santa Claus. That he was from Michigan, and almost all of Michigan was founded by Scandinavian people. And so they brought with them all of that Scandinavian imagery to their version of Christmas and in the Great Lakes area. And then when he graduates from Chicago, also in the Great Lakes, and gets hired by Coca-Cola, he spreads the Scandinavian version to the rest of America in the biggest way possible. However, and this is the part that as a scholar, I'm now like, this is going to be my mission if we do another Christmas show, buddy. Go to the next image.
Okay.
No one mentions him in the Sundblom articles. No one mentions Leyendecker.
Mm-hmm.
And Leyendecker, if you're a painter of figurative art in our generation, and we've been going through this great revival of figurative art education, people, almost every artist I know knows Rockwell, knows Leyendecker, right? And Leyendecker, if Sundblom is painting in 1931, his first Santa Claus, and Nystrom is painting 1870s to 90s, Leyendecker's painting Santa Claus from 1895 to the 1920s. He's in between the two of them, and he's doing them for covers of the Saturday Evening Post.
Wait, so he's
And
in red.
This
is before Coca-Cola?
Yeah. No, this
Oh.
is for this is his own thing. I mean, he's doing this for the
Wait,
Saturday
no or
Evening
yes?
Post.
This is before Coca-Cola. This isn't red because
This
of
is
Coca-Cola.
before Coca-Cola.
So I
Before
thought
Coca-Cola.
Coca-Cola was the reason for the red Santa Claus.
I'm confused too, because almost everything that I read out of like the I read about 8 articles. Half of them mention Sundblom as being the originator. The other half mention Sundblom as being the popularizer of what Nystrom did in Sweden. None of the 8 articles mentioned Leyendecker. And they're all talking about
What?
the popularization of Santa Claus. And I'm thinking to myself, but wait, like, Leyendecker was famous in his day for all of his magazine covers, and he's not making these in secret. You know, this was a cover of a
Oh, it's a national magazine.
of a national magazine. Yeah.
Oh, that's weird. I literally just
Here's
listened to a podcast like a few months ago about this, and they said, like I'd said earlier in the podcast, that the Santa Claus as we know it came out of the 30s when my father was born in 1945, which tripped me out. And I'm like, well, you mean my grandfather didn't know the red and white Santa Claus? And but I mean, that may not be true.
To be fair, this is not that much earlier. I mean, it's 30 years earlier, but it's not that much earlier, right?
It's kind of a big, yeah, but still the credits in the wrong place, it sounds
Okay.
like.
Can we take a moment and talk about Leyendecker and what we think about him?
Yeah, sure.
Can we zoom in a little bit on this
Absolutely.
guy? Make him a little bigger.
How close do you want to go?
I don't care. It's not close as you want to go. I just want to hear you talk about what you think about Leyendecker.
Well, I mean, I absolutely think he's a brilliant illustrator, brilliant painter. Is he my favorite painter? No. I mean, he's a little more stylized than I tend to like.
Yeah.
So he's not one of
Yeah.
my favorite painters, but that's just personal taste. But he's clearly got chops. I mean, he's clearly an incredible technician, and I mean, I don't know. I have nothing negative to say about him.
I've always admired and loved his work, but I haven't really known a lot about his biography, and I'm ashamed to say that. And I read a little bit about it as I was coming up on this podcast and thinking, okay, I should at least know some of the broad sketches. So he grows up in Chicago, just like Sundblom does. He's 50 years older than Sundblom. But Leyendecker had a completely commercial background. And this is what I mean by that. This is a topic for another podcast, but it's something that to me goes to the root of the environment that we live in today as artists who are trying to figure out where they fit in the world of digital modernism, illustration, fine art. If you were living at the end of the 19th century, more people were reading, and magazines started to become a bigger deal. And artists who were filling those magazines were generally classically trained. They had gone to the French Academy or another version of the French Academy, a school that had adopted the French curriculum, essentially, of studying from the nude. They were looking at classical statues. They were adopting all of the trappings of a classical education, but they were adopting those to a world of fashion illustration, magazine illustration, and some people were ridiculed for that. Leyendecker was surely in that group where at his time there started to emerge people who didn't see him as a serious artist and who didn't see subsequent artists or even his contemporaries like N.C. Wyeth or gosh, some of these names my brain is swimming right now. You've got later Rockwell, you've got even a later generation than that, Harry Anderson and Tom Lovell. A lot of these artists had real serious chops, but they were seen as illustrators or commercial artists, right? And that didn't exist very clearly in these beginning years when Nystrom and Leyendecker are working. Leyendecker was still producing portraits and some fine art for people for their homes, but he didn't see any shame in dedicating himself entirely to commercial purposes and see that as a contradiction of being a fine artist. Some people who are listening to the podcast may question that characterization because it wasn't until World War I, maybe 10 or 15 years after this image, when the art world becomes much more modernist, and then they start reevaluating who fits into which camp. But when this image is made, he's mostly commercially trained. As I was looking up his biography, he's going to commercial schools, and he is not really he's largely self-taught from what I understand in doing the human figure. He's not studying in nude drawing classes at ateliers or fine art schools. That's one of the things that I think makes him so interesting and original, is that he's almost a purebred graphic artist who knows that almost all his works are destined to be seen not as paintings, but he's doing them anyway with paint from models that he's heavily manipulating. Yeah. Right. And he's getting respect, at least initially, from fine artists. But this is something I'd like to investigate more. If you go to, there's a museum in Stockton, California, that has a lot of his works. And they've recently published a catalog on him. And they talk a lot more about his process. Even looking at this, it's pretty clear that he had a huge influence on Rockwell. We know this. This isn't a surprise to anybody who's listening to this. But we know a lot more about Rockwell than we do about Leyendecker. A lot more about Rockwell.
Yeah. Do you know if this is
Rockwell wrote his
painted in oil?
autobiography.
I'm sorry. Do you know if
No, go
this
ahead.
is painted in oil or gouache or
Yeah,
casein?
this is the original oil
Oh,
that
it is
that we're
oil.
looking at. This is the original oil.
Okay. Yeah, and I look at the background, it almost looks like it could be gouache or something. The white is so transparent.
It could be gouache. I on the background. I
Maybe it's
all I
mixed
could
media.
find was all I could find on this was private collection, and it just said oil,
Oh,
and
it
it's
is
got a
oil.
little
Okay.
dedication in the bottom left that he added after it had gone to the magazine. So the version this is the original oil that was given to a friend.
Hmm.
You know, one of the reasons we don't know a lot about Leyendecker, as far as I understand it, is that he was gay,
Mm-hmm.
and he was very private as a result of it. And so there's a lot that was probably lost because of that stigma that he felt at the time, that he couldn't be very open about, you know, his life in general. So he didn't write an autobiography like Rockwell did.
Right.
You know, he was
That's
pretty quiet.
unfortunate.
It's too bad.
Yeah.
Okay, next Christmas image.
Huh.
Okay, I'm going to be shocked if you guess who this is. I'm going to give you I'm going to give
Okay.
I'm going to give you some hints.
You'd be shocked
You
if I
know this
guessed what
art.
any artist was, who any artist was. You know me, my lack of
You know this
education.
artist very you know this artist very well, Jeff.
No, I
You know
don't.
him very well. You do. He's a turn of the century artist. You're not used to seeing his oil paintings,
Okay,
even
give
though
me a
you've
minute.
seen his oil paintings.
Can you give me a hint?
Um, he did a lot of graphic work. It's not a great hint.
I have
I'll
no
give you
idea.
another one.
Okay.
He worked in Paris, but he wasn't from Paris.
Yeah, I have no idea.
He was from Prague in the Czech Republic.
You're just you're just reinforcing the reality that I'm incredibly uneducated. So
No,
just
no,
tell
no,
me
no,
who
no,
it
no.
is.
You're gonna know the moment I tell you.
Okay.
He painted this on his final and ninth trip to the United States as an artist. This is Alphonse Mucha.
Oh my gosh. Of course.
You knew
Uh,
who you. I knew you'd know who he was.
really?
So he was. This isn't a private collection. It's an oil on canvas. It's about 36 by 24, from what I understand. I haven't seen it in person, and it's titled "The Spirit of Christmas." He did it in I think 1920s, and it's if anybody has ever seen reproductions of his Slav epic, where he does a lot of his very symbolist oil paintings that
Mm-hmm.
are they're gosh, they're haunting. They're just beautifully painted. This looks like that. It doesn't look like his graphic work. Um, this piece, I was shocked when when somebody shared it with me years ago. But there are some things I wanted to point out that are very old school in this Alphonse Mucha. Can we zero in on her face in that hand?
Yeah. I kind of want to, for the
Have you
viewers
ever?
who don't know Alphonse Mucha's work, I mean, I'm sure we have some viewers who don't. It'd be interesting to compare. Did you have another image by any chance?
No, but if you go onto Google right now and just type in Alphonse Mucha, he's really kind of famous for this Art Nouveau style, which was mostly seen
God,
in
his work is so
posters.
cool.
And his style of Art Nouveau took over Paris, it took over Brussels, it took over um, Chicago, New York, for the 1890s to to 1910, until another style took over. He was really famous for, I think almost everybody is familiar with this style, this Art Nouveau style.
Yeah. Was here's
And
another
so
one.
there's another painting. He was a
Yeah.
beautiful oil painter, and his graphic work as a poster maker is more famous than his painting work. But this is what I want you to do. Go back to Google
Okay.
and type in Slav epic after his name. Just keep his name there,
Oh,
or just put Slav, Alphonse Mucha, Slav, Slav epic.
Okay.
Now look at the image of your right to the right of where your hand just was, where your mouse was, of how big these images are. You've got people standing in front of a three pieces right there. These are like
Oh my
10 or 12 feet
gosh.
tall, and they're 25 feet long, and they're multi-figural works that were largely not seen by the public from when he painted them in the 1920s until the year 2000. There's about 80 years where they weren't seen. Czechoslovakia had a really rough run during World War II, and then during the Russian occupation. It's amazing they were preserved at all. But this is the kind of thing that when we look at his work as a painter is most comparable to the Spirit of Christmas that I sent you as an image. It gives you an idea of what his figurative work was like and how he was trained as a figurative fine artist in oil. And
Wow.
before he was famous for his poster work, he was known mostly for his portraits.
Hmm. Why did he go over to the poster work? Do you know?
I think it would have been very hard to not do so. If you were an artist who was trained like he was by these great monumental history painters of religious, basically giant wallpaper kinds of paintings, his teachers were largely paid for by the state. Like if you're working for the Czech government or the French government, you're on salary as a painter who's either doing monumental projects like this or you're teaching in the schools. And then in the 1870s, because of electric lighting and gas lighting and cheap lighting that came from whale oil, sounds crazy, but it's true. The general public can afford to read at night when it's dark. And so they start buying magazines and they start buying books and they want them to be graphic. And so, and also, the governments don't have as much money as they did before. The shift of patronage goes from government patronage of artists to commercial, everyday people buying artists' work. And so the best way to make money is to either paint for wealthy merchants portraits and things that fit over mantelpieces in their homes, or to paint for the print market for everyday people who are buying magazines and having book illustrations. So I mean, he's straddling both those worlds, and he does this project at the end of his life without really any audience in mind other than his own people. He's wealthy at this point, and he decides, I want my legacy to be these monumental, huge works. We should dedicate a show to Mucha's slave epic.
I would love that. These are unbelievable. This is my dream to do something like this, something this grand. So amazing.
I've only seen one image from the Slav epic. It's the one right down from your mouse. I saw this one in person of the patriarchs of the Eastern Orthodox Church. There's more to it than that, but it's huge, and you can see how ambitious it is. It's this multi-figural piece in an architectural setting, and it's got a narrative about the Slav epic is half about the conversion of Eastern Europe and half about the national story of the history of the Slavic people, not just the religious side of their story. And we'll talk about it in another episode. I need to do more homework on it, obviously. But now go back to the Spirit of Christmas that I sent you, that he did.
Whoops. There we go.
So one of the things that I find we're not used to seeing in portrait work today that was very common in the 19th century and earlier was this choice to make hands so much bigger in portraits. It wasn't that artists didn't know this, that the hand, look at how big her palm is in comparison to her face.
Yeah,
It was
I didn't
a
even
choice
notice.
it's a choice that was taught in the academies, that it looked strange if a hand was its actual proportion And so they deliberately enlarged it and made shapes with the fingers that would elongate fingers to make them more gestural and elegant.
No
And
kidding.
Mucha's one of the last people who I've seen painting in this style up until past the turn of the century. So he's not as influenced by photography in his time as he is from a very classical French education of enlarging for gesture and elegance sake the size of the hand. And the moment it's pointed out to somebody, it tends to bother them if they're from the modern age. But if it's not pointed out to you, most people don't notice it at all.
Yeah, I didn't even notice it. This episode is brought to you in part by Rosemary Brushes. If you're one of my listeners who's a professional artist, you're already using Rosemary brushes. But for the rest of you, come on. Take your work a little more seriously. Stop buying the other brands. It's just not worth it. Every now and then you may get lucky and buy a good brush from another brand, but use the brand that professionals like myself are using. Go to rosemaryandco.com, link in the description or the show notes, and get yourself some quality brushes before your next painting. You know what's crazy about this whole hand thing? I'm doing my family portrait right now, and once again, this happens to me all the time where I'll paint a hand on a figure and I know it's right. I mean, I'm sure of it. I'll check it. I know it's right, but it feels small. And I've had that happen my entire career. And so a lot of times, just instinctually, I've leaned toward, when in doubt, make it bigger. And that's just been instinctual.
You are naturally...
It's just weird.
That's really... It goes all the way back to the first art schools in Italy in the late 1500s. They start these rules of telling students that if you're going to paint a hand or sculpt a hand, it should be anywhere between 15 and 30% larger than it is. They didn't use percentages. They used different comparisons. And again, they're not after naturalism. One of the things that people like about Art Nouveau style, which he helped pioneer with those posters, is how organic it is. And people confuse something being organic with being natural. He was anything but natural. Even looking at this image, look at how designed and graphic that fabric is around her body. The way the hand is, the fingers are placed on her chest. I call them ballet hands when I sometimes talk about them, because she's got them like, I can't even curl my finger properly in that way that she's got her ring finger curled and the two separated. And then the other hand, which is at this weird, like almost right angle. And then the fingers are put in this very like impossible position.
I literally can't do that with my pinky. I guess if there's weight on it. I guess if there's weight on it, but that doesn't look like a very heavy ornament.
Maybe. So the overall goal of him is not to be accurate at all. It's all about a beautiful shape and design of everything. So the reason why the hand works and why we don't really notice it unless it's pointed out usually is because he knew that part of the wrist draws you into the interior of her. I mean, it immediately goes into shadow after you hit that highlight on her wrist, right? And it pulls it into her body, and it gives depth where there isn't normally depth with the hand in front of it. It's a beautiful little touch.
Yeah.
By
and
a
it
very
does
mature
feel big
artist.
if you stare at it, but at the same time, you say that they're not after naturalism, and I don't disagree with you. But if I think about my experience, I am after naturalism, and yet my experience has been that instinctually on a two-dimensional surface, an accurate hand doesn't feel naturalistic.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, I'd be curious, and I know you don't know this, and maybe there's no way of knowing it, but I'd be really interested in knowing what the root of that is, who the first one that came up with this idea that larger hands work better, and why. If it was more of an instinctual thing that kind of
Yeah.
evolved into a general
Into a
practice.
role.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay, that's that assignment accepted. I will try and find out.
that's 3 podcasts we came up with already.
Yeah,
Man,
yeah.
we got to write this stuff down.
Back up on the image a little bit so we can see the overall
Okay.
shape once
Okay.
again of it. Because I think the overall shape is, to me, what sells this image. It's just,
So is this supposed to be snow, or is this an
I
abstract
don't
element?
know.
This little
I don't know. I mean, it was painted for an American. Obviously got her in an Eastern European check dress. He's got this evergreen crown on her. He's got an apple, bells, a candle. I only found one person who commented on it, and the only thing they said is that it was definitely painted in America for an American on Mucha's last trip to America. And to me, one of the things that's fascinating about it is that this is when he's living in the world of Leyendecker, Rockwell, and others by this point. This is the 1920s, almost 1930s, and he's painting his version of Christmas after already being very, very famous for his graphic work. And he's not expecting this to be reproduced. It's for one person. I don't know if it's a portrait of the patron's, kid or wife or what, but he's doing if you put this next to Leyendecker or Sundblom, which are the popular images of very colorful, bright images of Christmas, which dominate the America at this time. This is a very subtle, I would even say sophisticated or mature palette.
Oh
and
yeah,
approach.
this is very
It's very
sophisticated.
elegant.
So the reason I ask if this is snow, my follow-up question is, what was the date of this? When was it painted?
I got the date of 1920 something. I'm gonna have to look it up, but it's the 20s.
Okay, because it feels to me like a photograph of a person in the snow would look, where you have these big snowflakes in the foreground. That's not the way you would perceive them from life. You're not going to focus on the big snowflakes in the foreground. You're not going to literally be able to physically focus on them. You're going to be looking at the figure. But when you take a picture of someone outside, you get these massive snowflakes right up close to the lens that are kind of blurry. And I wonder, do you know if he worked from photography? If it's possible that this?
It's very well documented. He was a massive user of photography.
Okay, my guess is that he used a photographic reference for this, and this was his interpretation of the snow that was in the photo. But of course, obviously, we can't know that.
I would almost kill for a Mucha, and this Mucha, like,
it's cool.
It melts me. It melts me when I see it.
It's really beautiful. Really beautiful. But to that photograph point, it's interesting though, even when using photography, he's still following those rules of the Academy with making the hands bigger. He's making major artistic decisions.
Yeah.
And not being slave to his reference, assuming that is how he did it. It's incredible.
No, and I think one of the greatest things about Mucha is his design. He is one of the greatest designers of paintings. If you just kind of squint your eyes and you look at the shapes and the values that he comes out with in everything he does, he's almost flawless in his decisions that he makes. Mm-hmm. He's just unbelievable. Those dark locks of hair that come down and break up the fabric on either side of that hand and kind of frame the hand, the way that the shadow of that hand goes, and then the very cool the temperature in her forearm on the one that goes to her chest, the highlight of the wrist, and then as it bends and it goes back and all darkens as it touches her chest. I mean, it's just, He's just
Well,
such
and
a
the face is these
beautiful
beautiful
painter.
dark halftones.
Oh
Instead of
yeah,
focusing the light
yeah.
on the face, he has it slightly turned down, so you get these really subtle halftones, and he reserves the lights, the really bright lights, for the dress in order to frame her face.
Yeah, imagine if you were a teacher and a student came to you and said, "Okay, the brightest parts of this painting are going to be the edges of the fabric on the left and the top and in the bottom right almost, right? But
Right.
I'm going to make her face one of the darkest parts of the whole image." And
Yeah,
you're
it
saying,
doesn't
"Okay,
seem
well, let's
intuitive at all.
let's see that let's see that work. Let's see you make the darkest part of the whole image her face, right? And the lightest part those areas." But
It
it's
makes
part of
me
his
wonder if
genius,
it's
man.
not a portrait, and if the idea behind it is to make it more of a picture than a record of a member of the patron's family.
That would very much be in keeping with his tradition too, because he did all kinds of allegorical figures of spring, of winter, of happiness, and his images are full of just these people whose we know now who the models are, but they weren't famous people. They were just types that he
Mm-hmm.
chose to put in his pieces.
Hmm. Hmm.
And this is titled The Spirit of Christmas. So,
Oh yeah, I bet it's not a portrait of a family member. Hmm.
okay, next image.
Okay.
This is by an American artist who he paints in he trained in New York City for a very short time, and then he goes to uh, um, uh, to Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he studies with a famous École des Beaux-Arts painter who we don't know as much now, but at the time his name was Francois Edouard Picot. He's kind of a co-teacher with people like Cabanel and Jerome at the École des Beaux-Arts. So Picot is one of the major teachers at that school. And then after learning these very um, traditional French painting techniques that were famous in the 19th century for, the kinds of artists that were his contemporaries were Bouguereau, was a contemporary of his who was studying at the school at the same time. He goes on to Italy and he starts studying how to do murals, and especially murals that are in that traditional what's the word I'm looking for? Gesso on walls,
Fresco.
um, fresco. He learns how to do fresco works,
Mm-hmm.
and he comes back to the United States and does these enormous frescoes, which are in the Library of Congress. Um,
Hmm.
and in fact, um, I didn't include many of them because we've just got too much to talk about. But his small works, which this isn't a tiny work, it's roughly, I think, 30 by 40. It's in the Milwaukee Museum of Art, and it's of the star that leads the wise men to Christ's birth in Bethlehem. That's what's happening in this image. All of his smaller works have the view of being almost giant landscape or murals, even if they're smaller. He's got a really good eye for making monumental works, even in small format. So
Hmm.
here you've got the Star of Bethlehem, which, notice, it's not at the center of the painting, and it's not quite the the uh, the
The
golden
golden
mean, but
mean.
it's pretty
Yeah.
close.
It's
It's pretty close, right? He's
it's
doing
really
something here.
close. Yeah.
It's really close,
Yeah.
but he didn't put it center, and he's got these clouds, which are how he's decided to depict the hosts of heaven that are looking down on where the Christ child
You know, that
is.
took me a solid 4 or 5 seconds to even notice that. I don't know why I'm
It's
so
a
slow.
it took me a few seconds too. I mean, it's one of those images where, first of all, it's super original. I've never
Yeah.
seen anything quite like it, and I like that he didn't make it look like an American Christmas. It doesn't. It looks like it could have been in the Middle East, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of looks like it could be a Western landscape too, but he's got the olive trees. He's got the figures coming from afar. I wanted to include it in our Christmas
I
image
really
program
like
just
it.
because he deserves more attention. He's a great artist.
I love the treatment of these clouds, the warmth. It's amazing what you can get away with clouds and still have it feel like a landscape. I mean, once you look
Yeah.
at it, it's all you can see. All you can see is the hosts of heaven. But like I said, it took me a solid 4 or 5 seconds. And when I just look at it as a whole landscape, the design of it is is really great. I mean, it's really
Isn't it
successful.
beautiful? You've
Yeah.
got that dark foreground with the lines that kind of curve towards the path that goes into the really good Disney animation still, where you've got like layers on layers,
Hmm.
right? You've got a foreground, a couple of middle grounds, maybe 3 or 4 middle grounds, and then a background. And then he's divided it vertically into 3 or 4 sections too. I mean, it's just beautifully thought out.
Well, and it's a really nice handling of values because he could have easily overdone down here. He has this feeling of a spotlight from the star, and yet he
Ah,
still
I didn't even think
reserved
of
his
that.
lightest lights for up here, and still that star
Yeah,
just glows. So he's got this feeling of brightness down here, but it's actually still really dark if you compare it to the source. That's really
it's
subtle
really
value handling. Yeah, I like
it's a
that.
beautiful piece. I wanted to share this before I share what is a really hard images that I'm about to show you,
Okay.
which are the dark side of Christmas. So as we all
What the?
know, in the in this story of the Christ story, he's born, and then almost immediately Joseph, who's Mary's husband, is warned that Herod's soldiers are going to come to Bethlehem and kill any child that was born during the birth of that star, right?
Yeah.
And scholars dispute how many children were born at that time and would have been massacred. The most recent article I've been able to find, we've got Roman statistics of how many people lived in Bethlehem. So we know how many children were born during that era, and it would have been between 12 and 30. That's what we think now.
Hmm.
That's how many would have been killed. But if you were a medieval collector of saints' relics, you one of the highest prize relics you could have bought was one of the innocents, they called it, one of the bodies of the children killed by Herod's soldiers. And currently in the world, there are at least 200 or 300 bodies that are claimed to be the relics of these children that died.
So 10
And in
times
the
the actual number of children.
10 times the actual number,
Hmm.
just like there are like 5 or 6 John the Baptist heads, there are, you know, 5 or 6 true crosses, there are 3 or 4 um, goblets from the of
Right.
the Holy Grail. In the 18th century, in the lead up to Christmas during Advent, if you lived in Italy or in Spain, there were these things called sacromontes, or sacred mountain journeys, where you would go to an actual mountain that had different stations that you would walk through telling the story. And one of them would be the Massacre of the Innocents. And you would have sculptors and painters working together, and they were usually at this royal quality. This was made for the royal family in Spain in the mid 18th century, so mid 1700s. And it had some of the best artists in Naples, Italy, which is where Ribera and Guido Reni were working, who painted these sculpted wood and then gessoed sculptures of the Massacre of the Innocents. And I've got to warn listeners and viewers that it's going to get rough, some of these images. But it was important to Christians to understand how horrific these events were. So the first one we've got to zoom in on is of the women attacking one of Herod's soldiers. Go to the next image.
Please tell me this
So
isn't
they're
your nativity scene at your house.
It isn't. This is the royal family in Spain's nativity scene. So you see these women are biting the leg of the one woman's biting the leg while she's being stabbed in the head, and another woman who's a grandmother is pulling on the hair, while another woman, and go to the next image, which is a side view of it. I mean, compositionally, that's pretty amazing. You got to admit, that is an amazing image. The next
Yeah.
image is the hardest one to look at. And it's of a baby that's been stabbed, and the mother is still trying to breastfeed it after it's been stabbed.
Oh my gosh.
This was a huge, huge part of the Christmas tradition, was not just the celebration of the nativity, but understanding the real depth of sacrifice that happened during this massacre of the innocents. It's
Oh
a
my
hard image
gosh,
to
that
look
one's
at.
heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. We don't include this anymore in our Christmas imagery. And if you're a painter, you're taking all the skills that you've learned on canvas, and your job is to put it on these sculptures. And you see that, you know, blood's coming through the back of that child, going over the arm of the mother, and the life is draining out of it. And so he's greener. There's a lot more burnt umber in his body than is in her warm body compared to it. It is, it is hard to look at.
So you said that this is the way they used to celebrate. Who is they? What cultures celebrated Christmas like
So
this?
if you're Italian or Spanish, you would go through these kinds of ritual pageants where you would explore the whole story of Christ, from the Annunciation until the resurrection, as part of this. And the Massacre of the Innocents was a celebration of those whose lives were lost for Christ's sake, as people who lived in Bethlehem, which I think is a really beautiful story that most Protestants don't tell. Catholics still talk about this. We don't really talk about the Massacre of the Innocents, but it was part of that Christmas Sacro Monte, the sacred mountain tradition of exploring not just the beautiful, wonderful miracles, but also the great tragedies and massacres that happened. And I'm telling you, like, I think there is a human nature part that, unless you do witness some of the terrible things or think about them, the low lows make the high highs higher, right?
Absolutely.
And when you see an image, if you see an image like this, it's hard to forget this image. And it's hard to forget the women attacking the soldier too, while they're trying to distract him from taking another baby, right? I mean, that's stuff we don't paint anymore.
Wow. It's never even occurred to me when I think of Christmas, that part of the story, maybe I should be ashamed to admit this, but that part of the story never even came to my mind. But now that it's been introduced, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, it's so obvious. Such a significant part of all those babies that died.
You don't need to feel bad about it. I just think it's part of, this podcast, and what we're doing is part of trying to remind us of it, right?
Yeah.
It's reminding us of these traditions. Okay, let's
Incredible.
go to, I think there may be one or two more images, but we'll go to something lighter. There we are. Okay. So, as part of the tradition of the Christmas story, and some people put this in the events out. I mean, it's obviously after he's born and after the wise men come, but in many traditions, like if you're a Syrian or Egyptian Coptic Christian, a huge part of the Christ story and of the Christmas celebration is talking about Christ coming into Egypt, right? And just like if you're a Syrian or Coptic Christian, which is the Christians in Egypt, you have your six stations of Christ coming and the miracles he performed as a youth in Egypt, which is a part we don't tell as Eastern Orthodox or as Catholic or as Protestants. This is another part of Christmas that we don't talk about a lot. And the artist who did this was he was a student of Jerome, and he traveled with Jerome to the Middle East. His name was Eugene Girardet, And I owned this painting. It was a painting that was in the Paris Salon, and he did two versions of it. I've got both versions to share with you. This is the first version. It is a brilliant image because it's got the temples that were built to the pharaohs with the sun god at the top of them passing through the desert, Joseph, Mary, and the Christ child, and it's got the sun rising through the pyramids behind Christ's head to make a halo. So zero in on that image by Girardet. It's on that part of the Christ child. Yeah, so that's, I mean, and look at how the light is coming up between the pyramids and it's shining on them.
Yeah.
It's like Christ is the new Pharaoh. He's the new sun god. He's the new the Messiah, and Girardet emphasizes it with the way that he's done that little twist.
That's a smart idea.
It's a brilliant idea, isn't it?
It's also a really risky idea because it's close to a tangent, but design-wise, where you have a line coming too close to the edge of another object, but it works beautifully. It's a really smart idea.
Now, I don't know if you can put two images side by side, but he did a second version of this.
So. No.
Which I like better.
This is the same guy?
And it's the same subject. He removes the pyramids. It is a better painting from a technical standpoint. Maybe not from a compositional graphic standpoint, but zero in on the figures here.
Let me just go back and forth real quick because I just want to compare those.
Yeah. They're both called Flight into Egypt.
Huh. Yeah, the second one's...
They were...
much more... What's the word? It's more sophisticated, much more refined, much more advanced. It feels more advanced.
The first one is a crowd pleaser. You've got the pyramids, you've got the sun, you've got the color palette. It's very brash and bright. I owned both of these paintings. Okay.
Oh man, you did.
This one is twice the size of the first one, and it is way more sophisticated.
I'd rather own this one.
I would too. Zero in on the figures on it.
Okay.
It is unbelievable. It is an unbelievable painting. I mean,
so you sold these to a collector?
The first one went to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is in their temple in New York City.
Okay.
The second one, I don't know where it's gone because it was bought by a dealer who was working on behalf of their client. And I don't know who that client is.
Lucky client.
And to me, this one is, I mean, if you're a viewer, I can see why graphically, especially if you're looking at it in a computer screen, the first one is a lot more exciting. This one in person is so, the first one's a great melody. The second one is a symphony.
Yeah.
Right? It is just so much more going on, so much more subtlety and brilliant choices and values. And really, like, the second one does more to share the desperation of a group of people traveling through the Egyptian desert. I mean, it's just so, even on a narrative level, the desolation of the land that they're traveling through, to me, on all levels, this second image does more for me.
Oh man, I'm even enamored with this. I guess this sagebrush. I don't know what you call it out in the Middle East.
I don't know what you call it either.
Yeah.
Oh, and the values of how he's going back to that purplish, bluish, mauve, lilac, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it's just the most delicious, subtle, incredible work of art.
Yeah, beautiful
And
transitions in color in the sky from blue to green to orange. Yeah, that's gorgeous. Man, you owned that for a while. That's awesome.
The first image would be one that you would want to sell posters of, or you could do in any, like a black or white, and people would love it. Right?
Yeah.
the second one wouldn't work as well as a black and white image. You
No,
have
it
to see
wouldn't.
the original, you know?
Mm, that's
Isn't it
beautiful.
just the greatest? Doesn't it just just make you happy?
Look at that sunset, or would it be sunrise?
I don't know. I don't know.
Huh,
I don't know.
man, that's gorgeous. Oh, did I jump ahead?
So no, this is who we
Okay.
need to talk about next. So this is an artist who is almost unknown to us today. He was a contemporary of Velázquez, who knew Velázquez, painted. He was not just a painter; he was also a monk. He was a friar, and this is huge. I mean, we're talking. This is almost 12 feet tall. It's of it's what we call the Adoration. The wise men have come, and by the 17th century, when he's painted this, 1600s, it was painted in let me get the exact year, 1612 to 1614. He's a young man at the time. There was a tradition that there were three wise men. Melchior, no, who is it? Melchior, Balthasar, and let me see if I can find the name right here. Balthasar, Melchior, and it'll come to me.
While
It'll
you're
come to me
thinking
when we're
about
talking.
it, can I just point something out that's very strange
Yeah.
about this painting?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have never in my life seen a painting with such mastery and at the same time so much well, this sounds terrible. At the same time amateur. I mean, look at that fabric. I don't
That
know that I've seen fabric
fabric.
ever painted that well in my entire life.
It in person, the fabric is so mind blowing. But then you look at the steps
insane.
that
Look
she's
at the
on.
steps. The perspective is terrible.
Well, and you know,
and
I
then the
think
faces are so wonky. I gotta wonder how that's possible. How you could be so good at painting this and mess that up. So that's interesting.
you know, he was really an enigma. The Prado did an exhibition of his work, and they were acknowledging how uneven he was. But you gotta also imagine this. This is going into a church that has an
Mhm.
architectural niche where it's mostly being seen in the dark and by candlelight. And so some of the things he's doing, like pulling those stairs out and those shadows and having that wall behind her be one thing and her sitting on a wall that's another way, are ways that he's trying to make her pop out of perspective under candlelight. And so it's not being seen in full daylight all the time. He's almost pasting her into an architectural niche in the context of the church. And so parts of the painting are, I mean, he is aware of the skewed perspective as he's doing it.
No, I don't
That's a
think. Well,
different-
can I disagree with you on that
That's
one?
well, this is where you're definitely right for sure.
Okay.
He's uneven in his figures.
No, I
But
mean even the
he is-
perspective. So you think that the perspective serves the nook that it's in?
He's deliberately doing something where it's like, if you've ever seen a Caravaggio where it's like you're looking at a table, but three or four objects look like they're falling off the table, but they're not.
Yeah.
That is a 17th century choice that he is living in that world where he's trying to make them fit simultaneously in the architecture of the building where the painting is installed, and he's trying to make them pop out of the architecture. So
Maybe.
I think it's
guess it's
I think it's a
possible.
choice. That's the way it's been described to me. But the unevenness of the figures is not.
I
same
think art
choice.
historians are very generous to artists, and I'm not speaking of you, but I mean in general.
You may be right.
I think
Yeah.
art historians. I remember when I used to take art history classes, and even as an amateur artist, I thought, is that possible that they're doing that on purpose? But let me tell you why I think he's not doing it on purpose. And it just occurred to me
Okay.
right after I said it makes no sense that he could paint this and these two blocks in the same painting. It just occurred to me, this just happened with a student yesterday. I kid you not.
Okay.
So the order of my curriculum is we draw and learn how to see and see proportion and draw accurately. Then we move into full value, and then we move into value and paint. But somewhere between that full value and paint, depending on the students, individual students and their strengths and weaknesses, will often incorporate perspective in that general area. With this particular student, she just started in value, and she's really not just started. She's been doing it for about a year or so. So she's a little ways into it, actually. She's very, very good at it. And she rendered this beautiful skull. Like, it is, I couldn't do better myself. And it's sitting on a block, like a little crate. It looks like a little milk crate, but miniature. It must have had, I don't know, berries or something in it, set upside down with the skull on top. I went to critique it, and everything was pristine. The sheet that was draped over was pristine. Everything was pristine, except all the angles or many of the angles on the crate were way off. And she's never had any education in perspective. And I pointed them out, and it took her a minute to recognize it. I had to explain how certain angles recede, and these angles, how it's 2-point perspective, and these recede to this vanishing point, and these recede to that. And she generally didn't know that because we hadn't talked about it. And perhaps that's a problem with my curriculum. But I honestly think that might be what's going on here, where this student has been trained in rendering form, but never taught 1 or 2-point perspective.
You may be right. I'm not going to contradict you.
Well, I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
My explanation is a very tortured explanation for why it happened. Yours is a much more straightforward explanation.
Yeah.
And so you're probably right. Now let's point at something else, though. I have never seen another artist in the history of art who has this palette, ever.
What is it?
I've never seen this palette.
Diverse? You mean the huge range in color?
Yeah, and it's the very huge chroma and the very the chromatic choices he's making here are unlike anything that's in Spain, that's in France. I mean, he's just like his own thing, and I feel like it's a shame that we're not seeing it under candlelight. Because can you imagine?
Oh, all these colors. Like? The blues would look more dull under candlelight. Oh, it would be a shame.
And the figures would look like they were popping out too a little bit, like the bald head would be popping out. All the bright whites would be coming out. You'd see, candlelight on black figures, which you don't see that often, is a brilliant choice because you have their faces show up different from people who are whiter, right? And so if you look at how he's taken the black boy and then the black magi who's there, or magus is the singular for that. He's put that figure at the brightest light, and he's kind of had to highlight him a little bit differently. It's a real, and he had black fellow brothers in his monastery where he served, we know, that he had close relationships with, who may have been the model for that magus that was in this figure, that was in this painting, that is. And so you don't see a lot of black figures done in the 17th century, except by Velázquez, who had Juan de Pareja, who was one of his assistants that was also an amazing painter. I just think that, as overall choices in this painting, he's not an artist that's looked at a whole lot. He's kind of anonymous in the history of art. And there are good reasons maybe, but there are other reasons why I think artists should look at him for some of the interesting choices he does. If anything,
for this,
the fabric.
Oh my gosh. You know what this palette reminds me of? Nelson Shanks.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I can see, yeah.
Yeah, he has a really, really, really diverse, wide palette in his paintings. Yeah.
Okay, wow. I've got one final painting for you. One more.
Okay. Is this it?
This painting is, and this is it. this was done by an artist named Raphael Mengs. So Raphael Mengs was he was born in Germany, but he worked for the Royal Spanish Court in Italy, and then he moved to Madrid. And he paints this as one of his final works. You can see that there's a lot of cracking in it. It's in wood, and it's kept in this very back corner of the Prado Museum. And to me, it is one of the most beautiful Adoration of the Shepherds paintings I've ever seen in my life. And my least favorite part of it is Mary and the Christ child. My favorite part of it is the upper part with the angels who are circling and the shepherds who are approaching it, and Joseph, who's in the foreground on the left, who's the only one who can see the angels above. And then above his shoulder is a self-portrait of Mengs himself, the artist.
Right here?
Who's pointing to the scene. Yep, that's a self-portrait of Mengs, who painted this in his 60s. But if you go up close to it, Mengs hugely influenced Goya. He hugely influenced a lot of artists of his time. And he's living at a time when it's not as important to be realistic as it is to be colorful. Neoclassicism is very important, so there a lot of the features are idealized and forced to make things look otherworldly and very symmetrical. Mengs, I've never seen anybody who can make things look like a mix of porcelain fakeness and naturalism like he does, in a way that always, I don't know why it gets to me so much, Jeff. Nobody paints like this anymore. Look at that shepherd's hand where the light's coming off of Christ and it's shining through the fingers. And then his forearm, how it's foreshortened. And then his legs, look at his knees. And
I wish I had those legs. I mean, those are some nice legs.
I wish I did. He's obviously exaggerating how how muscly that shepherd is. And it's kind of almost weird and cartoonish, but it's so satisfying. And then you compare the humans to those angels, which are all smooth and beautiful. And I mean, those angels are just little poems. Every one of them is a little poem. I've always been in love with this painting. And I know that it's not very popular to paint like this. And I don't know if it ever will be again, but I feel like we've lost something with this idealized version of the human form that he is so good at.
I think this is the process.
What do you think?
Well, my impression is this is the process where artists use a really refined, smooth grisaille and then stack on layers of glazes in order to bring in the color. And I've noticed as I've been to various museums that artists will often be easy on the glazes with some figures and heavier on the glazes with others. For whatever reason, I don't know why. You'll have one figure that the flesh is, they've managed to pile up enough glazes to get the flesh to look really fleshy, and then others you almost see right down to the underpainting. And and I've never known why it works out that way, but that's what it looks like to me. It looks like Mary's almost completely underpainting with just a little bit of glaze on her lips and cheeks, and then this guy is just brought to complete finish. And I don't understand it. I appreciate it, but I don't understand it.
Yeah. I wonder if it's because it's a way of creating depth. That figures in the foreground were kind of brought into the circle of the painting. It's a huge painting. This painting is about 8 feet tall. Those vertical lines you're seeing throughout it are from where the wood is starting to crack and bend.
Yeah.
Because it's all on wood panel. His self-portrait is one of the most gorgeous self-portraits
right here
I've ever seen in person. It's so beautiful.
It really is nice. It's very naturalistic. I think it's the most naturalistic portrait in the whole painting.
I
The
think you're
rest of them
right.
feel more like a caricature, and his
Which
feels like very real.
which just tells you how much of a choice it was, because you have to remember these guys are trying to imagine this moment as if it's almost a dream. They don't want it to look like people they know. They want it to look like types of people that are almost like Alphonse Mucha's allegorical figure. These are not meant to be portraits of people. They're meant to be sucked. You're supposed to look at this as if you're sucked into a window of another world and a dream, not real. It's not the real world. It's an imagined world.
That's what I love about
And
talking to you, Micah, because you always come at it with this idea that the artist meant to do it. I always come at it from a more practical standpoint as far as the craft is concerned. What I thought, I'm not sure if I'm right, but it's just, I find it almost humorous how the difference in our perspective because of our different professions. But I thought, oh,
yeah.
well, of course his face looks more real because he's the only model that's always available.
Oh, he has all the money and the models in the world. He does.
Really?
I know this, and I know this is a choice on his part. I know it. I
Okay.
know it.
But isn't that funny
Because
though?
I
I always
know,
go to the practicality of it. I'm like, well,
yeah.
yeah, his looks more real because he only has to look in a mirror. The rest of them, they need to go home or go to work.
If you're looking at his contemporaries like Vicente Lopez or even Jacques Louis David, all of those guys are doing these almost cartoonish figures. And then in other paint, and that's when they're doing historical or religious or allegorical scenes. But the moment they do a portrait commission of a real person, they make them look very realistic. And they even talk about them when they're talking about making these images as if, oh, no. You have to back off and stop making that person look so real. You need to make them look more like the idealized version of the
Yeah,
Virgin Mary,
you're
the
obviously right.
idealized version.
That makes
So,
sense. Hmm.
I mean, this is part of what I'm talking about too, is that we don't have these idealized versions in our paintings anymore.
Mm-mm.
We don't do this. And I think something's lost a little bit of it because we're so used to, maybe our version of it is we look at these Avengers figures in movies that are these movie stars who, when they're interviewed, they talk about being sewn into their clothes, and they talk about like having to go on these impossible diets where they have to dehydrate themselves for a day while they're doing a scene so their muscles stick out even more. And then they go back to a more natural version of themselves when the filming's over. That's our version of an imagined, idealized world potentially and this is their version of it. Their version of it is like porcelain skin and that's never seen daylight and smooth edges, and he's deliberately contrasting the shepherd's worn muscled body with the porcelain figures in heaven.
Yeah. There are a few artists that still do idealized, or I don't know if idealized. I suppose you could say idealized or characterized or distorted figures. I mentioned it in the last podcast with you, although I don't know if we posted that podcast, but we had talked about it before. The Adam Miller is one of those artists that does.
Okay.
He sort of goes away from naturalism a little bit, but it's so much harder to do today when everything else in the world is so real. I mean, video games and movies and cameras, and it feels as an artist, as a painter of representational things, it seems more difficult to settle for a caricature of a face. But maybe that's the weakness. Maybe that's my own personal weakness rather than cultural. I don't know.
I don't think it's a weakness. I just think it's a different taste in different eras,
Yeah.
Back off on the image a little bit. One thing I do want to talk about before we finish on this image is I want to talk about his compositional choices when it comes to color and values, and what you think about how he's decided to lead the eye around when it comes to lights, darks, warms, cools. It's
Uh, I mean,
and I know it's hard to do on a computer screen versus in person.
yeah, I certainly have no criticism. You know, I'm not one. I mean, obviously, I'm capable of criticizing other people's art, but it has to be like that perspective thing. Like in my mind, it has to be a technical issue. With something like composition, it's so subjective. So could it be
Yeah,
better? I have no idea. You know, to me, composition is very subjective that way. I like the
yeah,
composition. I like the way everything points at Christ
yeah,
and at Mary.
yeah,
I like the way he's really subdued every color, but even the reds he's subdued. But he
yeah,
focuses all of his attention on this color as far as chroma is
yeah,
concerned, which is around Mary. That's the only chromatic color in the entire painting, and then takes
yeah,
one step up in chroma to these reds right here, which I'm sure is not a
yeah,
coincidence because if you think that the classic colors in history of religious paintings, red and blue, I mean, you see Christ in red and blue all
yeah,
the time, symbolizing, correct me if I'm wrong, sacrifice and royalty.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, so to me, that seems really intentional. And it's this nice little triangle that he's created with those chromatic colors that
yeah. I
bring you back
love
down to
the
here.
I love all the hand gestures. I love his hand that's going back but also across, and then the angel which is coming forward and reaching towards the middle. You can draw a line almost directly to their hands. The shepherd's hands that are coming to the middle, the feet of the angels which are kind of the one on the left that's framing the the scene in one area, the hand of the figure that's behind Mary's head, which is also a through line hand.
Oh,
I
I
mean,
didn't
they're
even
just
see
like
that one.
they're just a lot of little subtle. If you were to draw lines throughout this piece and pull up how he's framing the narrative and drawing your eye around with
Mm-hmm.
highlights on the tips of the fingers of one
Whoops.
figure in the background, the tips of the fingers of the staff of that figure on the far right, and the
Oh, right here.
and the and the triangle and how that leads over through the back into the face of the other shepherd as a staff. It's lots of little subtle compositional choices that he's making. It's a painting that if you had to make this into a black and white, it would still work, I think, because you could see all of those lines and value choices that were being made. It's even if it's as complicated as it is with, I don't know, there may be 15, 20 figures in there on some level, and
Mm-hmm.
it still is simplified enough with the
Yeah.
choices, the overall choices. He's really he's really a brilliant painter. And at the same time, if you were to compare this to the cheesiest Christmas images that you and I grew up with on Christmas cards, those are a pale version of the kind of this image. This is the master version of cheap Christmas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to make a couple more comments as I'm listening to you. I'm thinking about some other things. As a narrative painter, I feel like he's done some really sophisticated things that I find hard to do. He's
Yeah.
come up with just some great solutions and some great candid, unpredictable additions like this dog coming in right here.
Yeah.
There's no need for a dog. But what it does
No, there
is
isn't.
it's not part of the story at all. I mean, there's no dog in the Christmas story. But what it does is it makes it a familiar scene or a familiar place that we can relate to better because we all know dogs. We're all comfortable with dogs. It makes it more, in a way, by bringing a dog in, it almost makes the whole scene more human, ironically, by bringing a dog in.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is
Yeah.
he creates this secondary light source right here just to figure out how to
Yeah.
illuminate these figures in the background. And just to get enough light on them so that they're part of the painting and they don't disappear into the shadows, which I think was really
And
smart.
he's got them enough there that they're there, but not so much that they distract from the central focus either.
Yeah.
Which is a real coup. It's a real coup.
And I also like how, I don't know how he pulled it off. I guess it's pretty obvious. He just didn't do it, and somehow it works. But he didn't make Christ glowing with all these rays of light coming off the way it's often done. He just suggested that Christ is glowing by making him full value and then having the light in all the right places on all the surrounding figures, suggesting that the light is coming from him.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think of that. I didn't think of that.
Yeah, it's pretty smart painting. I also like some details like this little thing. I keep looking at this.
Oh, I do too. That's a censer that they would have put in a Catholic church. They put the incense that they go up and down the aisles in, and so he's suggesting that Joseph, you can see Joseph, who's sitting in the foreground, is looking up at the angels. He's the only one who can see them.
Is that where he's looking? He's not looking at this guy. He's looking up. I guess he is. It's hard to tell in this.
He is looking
picture.
up. It's clearer in the image, and it kind of makes you wonder if he can smell them, and that's why he's looking up, because he can smell the incense coming out of the censer. It's to me, this painting. Whenever I think of Christmas, I think of this painting, because Christmas is this time where we're supposed to take ourselves out of the drudgery of everyday life into something a little more fantastical and imagined. And we're encouraged to do that. We're supposed to think of things as being, our life is heightened in a way through Christmas, just like this painting is. It's not, and we're supposed to be Joseph, who notices the angels when nobody else is noticing them, right? We're supposed to be noticing that miracle in our lives. I know that sounds cheesy, but I embrace it fully, because I think that's what Christmas is about. Christmas is about looking at the miracles of our everyday life. Albert Einstein said there are two ways of looking at the world. Nothing is a miracle and everything is a miracle. And I think everything is a miracle at Christmas. And that's where you get a painting like this that reminds you that there are things in life that we don't see and that we don't understand. And at Christmas, we try a little harder to see them. And it's weird and it doesn't always work and it's cheesy and we love it anyway.
Yeah. Well, Christmas is my favorite holiday. And if my viewers are not religious people, maybe we can just look at the positive things happening in this crazy world during the Christmas season and try and focus on the good for a month.
Yeah. Well, and even if you're not into Christmas, this is what Dungeons and Dragons and magic and fantasy art is about too, right? I mean, this is what Miyazaki films are about. The Studio Ghibli of things are a little more fantastical at Christmas. And we should, even if we're not religious, we should take on a visual and artistic level, we should take a cue from artists and try and make things a little bit more about that fantasy miracle side, I think, of life. That's what I think.
It's good advice.
I'm going to stick to it.
Good advice, Micah. Hey, man, thanks again for your generosity. That was a Christmas present to all of us. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Merry Christmas, Jeff.
Merry Christmas to you. Thanks for tuning in to the Undraped Artist Podcast. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you could, leave a comment or review. That really helps the channel. Please share the show with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, consider a monthly donation at theundrapedartist.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.